London, in 1665, the heart of a growing empire, a city of 500,000 souls crowded into narrow streets that hadn't changed since medieval times. From above, it looked majestic. The Thames River cutting through the city like a silver ribbon, church spires reaching toward heaven, ships from across the world docked in the harbor, bringing silk from China, spices from India, and tobacco from the Americas. But there was another London, a city suffocating under its own filth. If you walked these streets, the cobblestones weren't just wet from rain, they were slick with human waste. The air didn't smell of bread and flowers, it reeked of death. This video is a descent into that nightmare. Through historical records and eyewitness accounts, we will explore the streets, the homes, and the plague pits where Londoners fought just to survive another day. This is history without the filter. Welcome to Cheapside. To the merchants, this was the commercial heart of London, a place where fortunes were made selling wool, leather, and imported goods. To everyone else, it was a living hell. Notice the architecture. Houses built so close together that neighbors could shake hands across the street from their windows. The upper floors jutted out over the lower ones, blocking out the sun. Some streets were so narrow that two people couldn't walk side by side. The ground floors were shops and workshops. The upper floors housed entire families in single rooms. 10 people sharing a space no bigger than a modern bedroom. 3 generations sleeping on straw mattresses on a dirt floor. Privacy didn't exist. Neither did ventilation. Windows were small and kept closed to avoid the bad air that was believed to spread disease. And beneath it all, the streets themselves were open sewers. In 1665, there were no bathrooms, none. Not in the grand houses of the wealthy, not in the hovels of the poor. Nobody had indoor plumbing. Families used chamber pots during the night. In the morning, they simply opened their windows and threw the contents into the street below. The law required them to shout, "Gardy-loo," as a warning, but most didn't bother. If you were walking below at the wrong moment, you took your chances. The streets were rivers of filth, human waste mixed with animal carcasses from butcher shops, rotting vegetables from the markets, and blood from barber surgeons who drained patients in the belief it would cure their ailments. All of it flowing downhill through open gutters toward the Thames. The smell was so overpowering that wealthy merchants held perfumed handkerchiefs to their faces just to breathe. The poor had no such luxury. They simply lived with it. Dogs, pigs, and rats roamed freely, feeding on the garbage. Dead horses were left to rot where they fell. Nobody cleaned the streets. That wasn't anyone's job. The rain was the only sanitation system London had, and when it didn't rain for weeks, the filth accumulated into mountains. All roads in London led to the river, the Thames. In 1665, this wasn't the picturesque waterway you see in modern films. It was brown, churning, and toxic. Look at the chaos on its surface. Ships unloading goods from across the empire, fishermen casting nets for eels and salmon, ferrymen rowing passengers from bank to bank, and directly beside them, pipes dumping raw sewage into the current. This was where Londoners got their drinking water. They filled buckets from the same river where they threw their waste, where butchers dumped animal guts, where tanners soaked animal hides in lime and urine. The connection between contaminated water and disease wouldn't be understood for another 200 years. Until then, cholera, dysentery, and typhoid were just part of daily life. You drank the water and you hoped you didn't die. Down in the mud at low tide, children known as mudlarks waded through the toxic sludge, searching for dropped coins, old nails, lumps of coal, or bones that could be sold to soap makers. Their feet were bare, their hands were raw. Many didn't live past their teens. The river wasn't beautiful to them. It was a monster that occasionally offered up a gift. If the streets were dangerous, homes offered little refuge. Space was more valuable than gold in 1665 London. A single room might house 10 people. Entire families shared one bed. Others slept on the floor, packed together like sardines for warmth. And there was no running water, no toilets, no heating, except for a single fireplace that also served as the kitchen. Bathing was rare. Most people washed their faces and hands, nothing more. The belief was widespread that hot water opened your pores and let sickness enter your body, so they avoided it. Doctors actively warned against bathing. Noblemen boasted about not bathing for months. Queen Elizabeth I reportedly bathed once a month, and that was considered excessive. So people lived with lice, they lived with fleas, they lived with bedbugs that infested every mattress and every crack in the walls. Scratching yourself raw was just part of being alive. Diseases spread effortlessly in these conditions. Tuberculosis, smallpox, measles, scarlet fever. If one person in a house got sick, everyone got sick. Children were especially vulnerable. Half of all children born in London died before the age of 5. It wasn't unusual for a woman to give birth to 10 children and see only 2 survive to adulthood. Death was so common that people became numb to it. Funerals were daily occurrences. Grief was a luxury nobody could afford for long. When the sun went down, the true face of London was revealed. There were no streetlights. The only illumination came from the occasional lantern carried by a night watchman or a wealthy merchant with a servant walking ahead. Most streets were pitch black, and in that darkness, the city belonged to the rats. Thousands of them, tens of thousands. They fed on the mountains of garbage that accumulated in every corner, every alley, every gutter. They nested in the walls of houses, they crawled over sleeping children, and in the fleas that lived on those rats was a killer. Yersinia pestis, the bacteria that causes bubonic plague. In the spring of 1665, it began. A handful of deaths in the slums of St. Giles in the Fields, a poor neighborhood on the outskirts of the city. The victims showed strange symptoms, swellings in their necks and armpits, high fever, delirium, then death, usually within 3 days. At first, nobody paid much attention. People died all the time in St. Giles, but then the death spread to other parishes. 10 in 1 week, 20 the next. By June, it was clear that something terrible had arrived. The symptoms were horrific. Black swellings called buboes erupted in the neck, armpits, and groin, growing to the size of apples. The skin around them turned purple and black, giving the disease its name, the Black Death. Fever so high it cooked the brain. Vomiting of blood. Seizures. Delirium. Most victims died within 3 days of showing symptoms. Some died within hours. Samuel Pepys, the famous diarist, wrote in June 1665, "This day, much against my will, I did in Drury Lane see 2 or 3 houses marked with a red cross upon the doors and 'Lord have mercy upon us' writ there, which was a sad sight to me. Those were plague houses. Once someone inside fell ill, the entire family was locked in by order of the city authorities, sealed alive with the infected. A guard was posted outside to make sure no one escaped. Food was passed through a window. Most families died together in those sealed houses. By July, the death toll was rising exponentially. 50 deaths a day, then 100, then 200. The wealthy fled the city. King Charles II and his entire court retreated to Oxford. Merchants shuttered their shops and left for the countryside. Doctors abandoned their patients. Anyone who could afford to run, ran. But the poor had nowhere to go. They stayed in London and watched as their neighbors, their friends, and their families died. Entire households were wiped out overnight. Streets that had been crowded and noisy fell silent. Grass grew in the marketplaces. By August, London was a ghost city. 1,000 people were dying every week. The church bells that traditionally rang for every death finally stopped. There were too many dead to ring for them all. The only sound was the rumble of death carts rolling through the streets at night. Men walked ahead, ringing bells and calling out, "Bring out your dead." Bodies were stacked like firewood and hauled to plague pits outside the city walls, mass graves so large that thousands were buried together in a single trench, without ceremony, without coffins, without even names. The authorities tried everything to stop the plague. Bonfires were lit on every street corner to purify the air. Doctors believed the disease spread through miasma, bad smells that rose from rotting garbage and sewage. So they thought smoke would drive it away. It didn't work. Cats and dogs were blamed for spreading the disease. An order was issued to kill every cat and dog in the city. Over 40,000 were slaughtered. But this only made things worse. With no predators, the rat population exploded. People walked the streets holding sponges soaked in vinegar to their noses, believing it would protect them. Others wore leather beaks filled with herbs and flowers, looking like nightmare birds. Children were forced to smoke tobacco. The theory was that smoke in the lungs would drive out the plague. Desperate families tried charms, prayers, and potions sold by con artists. None of it worked. The death toll kept climbing. By September, the plague reached its peak. Over 7,000 people died in a single week. That's 1,000 deaths every day. One death every 90 seconds. The city ran out of gravediggers. The living were too terrified to touch the dead. Bodies lay rotting in the streets for days before anyone dared move them. And then, in November, something changed. The cold arrived. Rats died. Fleas died. The plague loosened its grip. By December, the worst was over. But the damage was done. Over 100,000 Londoners were dead. 15% of the entire population gone in a single year. Families destroyed. Entire bloodlines erased. The city was a graveyard. A year later, in September 1666, another disaster struck. A fire started in a bakery on Pudding Lane. It spread quickly through the tightly packed timber houses. For 4 days, the Great Fire of London consumed the city. 13,000 homes destroyed. 87 churches burned to the ground. The medieval city that had stood for centuries was reduced to ash, but in a twisted way, the fire was a mercy. It burned away the filth, the rat-infested timber houses, the narrow plague-ridden alleys. When the city was rebuilt, it was done with brick and stone. Streets were widened. Building codes were enforced for the first time. Slowly, painfully, London began to modernize, but it would take another 200 years before the city finally built a modern sewer system. It wasn't until 1858, during the Great Stink, when the smell of the Thames became so unbearable that Parliament couldn't meet, that the government finally acted. Engineer Joseph Bazalgette designed over 2,000 kilometers of underground sewers that finally separated drinking water from human waste. That system still functions today. Looking back at London in 1660, we don't just see a city, we see a warning. This was a place where ignorance killed more people than war ever could, where the simple act of drinking water was a death sentence, where entire families were sealed in their homes to die together, where children walked barefoot through toxic sludge just to survive, where the streets literally ran with human waste and nobody thought to change it. This is the history they don't show you in costume dramas. No romance, no elegance, just mud, disease, rats, and the smell of death. The London of 1665 was a nightmare dressed in silk and stone, and the people who lived through it were far tougher than we could ever imagine. Thank you for walking through the shadows with us. This is History Without the Filter. Subscribe to explore more of the past as it really was.